All right, so I'm going to be making a really short video on the field strip and complete disassembly of a Glock pistol. You're going to see in this video a lot of specialized tools for this. However, you don't necessarily need these specialized tools. I will say that it's very useful to have a punch and maybe a hammer, but just understand that if you're not experienced with this process, then it would be best to go slow and not try to force anything with this pistol. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. The particular pistol that I chose for this is a Glock 19 Gen 5. Just understand that there's going to be some differences in the parts of the pistol in between Gen 3, 4, and 5. Notably, with Gen 3 and 4, you will have 2 pins right here. Gen 5, as you can see, only has 1. So, this gun has a light on it, so your gun probably will not, and every single manufacturer has a different type of spec for their lights, notably how they interlock with the frame. So that's something that you'll have to read up on your own time, depending on what kind of light you have. Anyhow, before we get started, go ahead and make sure that your pistol is not loaded, that the chamber is clear. If you're in an area that doesn't have a bunch of fancy lights and stuff, you can put your finger inside of the chamber to do a physical inspection to make sure it's not loaded, but also a visual inspection in the chamber to ensure that it's clear. Go ahead and drop the slide whenever you're ready. And on a Glock, it does seem counterintuitive, especially if you're a new shooter, to do this. And this is part of why I'm a little hesitant for a new person who's never done this to have a Glock. But it is okay to dry fire this weapon after you've made sure that it is not loaded in order to disassemble this weapon. Also make sure that the weapon is pointed in a safe direction when you do this. What you're going to do once you've pulled the trigger as a part of the disassembly process is pull it back just a hair. If you see how I'm holding it, I've found that this is the most comfortable way to hold the weapon. So the slide is essentially going to come just barely out past the rear dovetail right here. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put your finger over the top of the slide, and on either side there's this takedown lever notch on this gun, right? You're going to put your thumb and pointer finger, those are going to be your 2 strongest fingers here. You're going to push down on either side. These takedown levers actually do move down right here, right? It's spring loaded. But you have to push down evenly on both sides in order to unlock the weapon. Once you've done that, just pull the slide forward right off of the frame of the weapon. And I'll get into the disassembly of this here in a second. Now, once you have the frame or the slide of the gun, you have a couple of key components that you will notice. In order to field strip a Glock pistol, all you're going to do is push forward on the spring a little bit, and you have your spring here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put all these parts inside of a little magnetic tray, right? And just so that way the camera can see, I'll put it at an angle here. So you have the spring that comes off, and then if you push up on the chamber right here, because this is a tilting breech block style pistol, right? What you're going to do is you're going to push up on this a little bit and pull back, and there's your barrel. And that is essentially a field stripped weapon. This right here, you do not need to take this down any further if you intend on field stripping it. The same goes with your slide, your barrel, and your spring. If you're watching this video in order to learn how to clean the weapon, you just want a basic field strip, you don't have to go any further. I'll say you don't actually have to clean the spring. Most of the time, if you get into a watery environment, right, I would just recommend that you get like an air compressor or some canned air. If you have canned air, right, maybe just make sure that this enclosure up front has this stamped metal around it. Make sure you get between that and blow in there. But You don't actually have to oil this guy. I believe that this is chrome steel. It's not stainless steel because the actual springs aren't magnetic, but regardless, just make sure it's dry. You don't actually have to oil this thing. Now, as far as the barrel is concerned, if you are watching to clean this, what I would say is the most amount of fouling on these guys actually occurs right up through here, the feed ramp right here, the top of the chamber right here. I would also wipe down here, and then right at the crown of the muzzle. The crown is this little recessed piece right here where the rifling meets the muzzle of the barrel. I would just give that a wipe down like this, and then, you know, probably get a brush for this part, brush it down, get all the carbon off. And then if you're going to go ahead and clean the bore, they do sell kits to run through the bore right here in order to get it clean. I will say that usually if you have solvent and a cleaning rod and either a jag or a little loop to put some patch on it, you can just put some solvent down through here, but make sure you neutralize that solvent with the oil-soaked rag through here. It doesn't have to be soaked, but your average 9mm patch is going to look like one of these guys right here. If you don't have these or you're tight on money, you can use these shirts, really. What I do is I usually keep a little stockpile of shirts around just in case I'm running short if I have a big cleaning project to do, and I'll chop one of these up into a little square like this. Since this is a 9mm patch, I'll say that this square, that's 2 by 2. It's a 2 by 2 square, so you can do rough estimations and it'll still go right through the thing. All right, so other thing is if you field strip it and you're cleaning it, I would probably lightly brush your rails right here. You will see on this frame, there's a rail here, rail here, rail here, rail here. Wipe those down, and then I would also get a Q-tip. If I were you, I would get one of these guys if you have somebody else that is taking a look at your gun to make sure you've done a good job cleaning this. I would get down in here with a Q-tip right around through here and brush in there, and this little gap right here in between the trigger bar and the trigger pack back here. I'd make sure that you get in there. Basically any little nook and cranny in there. The thing with the Glock is that because this weapon has some looser tolerances inside of the frame, it does have a lot of carbon that gets all over the place. So as you'll notice, I do keep my Glock pretty clean, but I can still find some carbon. And if you don't have, say, a Q-tip around for whatever reason, you can get a cleaning patch and, you know, wipe through this thing, right? Wipe the slide rails, wipe the ejector, all that stuff. Just basically anywhere where you think that there's a little bit of dirt, and guarantee you'll probably pick up a little bit of carbon right there. So that concludes the field strip process. Keep watching if you want to know how to take this whole thing down, which I'll get started with here in a second. Since we already have the slide most of the way apart, we'll go ahead and start with that. So let me go ahead and move those, and I'll do the slide right here just so that way it's in the frame. But the thing to remember about the slide is that there are springs that are under tension inside of this gun right now. If you don't do this carefully, you're likely going to lose a piece or two of the slide itself. And with the way things are going, it might be difficult to get any spare parts for these, especially as polymer 80s and stuff like that become more popular. It's become harder and harder to get Glock parts. So a little tip or trick about this that I found is, because the springs in here, as far as the slide, how it's currently oriented, is the springs are under tension vertically right now. So I would keep a hand over your rear slide plate right here in order to make sure that nothing flies out that's not supposed to. And I'll show you here in a second. Now what you'll see on this slide is the striker right here. When you saw me pull this back right there, right, what you saw was the striker plunger. This is one of the safeties in a Glock, pop up, right? The trigger bar also interfaces with this component. So on a Glock frame right here, this is the trigger bar, right? That actually interfaces with this guy right here. Spring loaded as well. Like I was saying, there are components in this thing that are under spring tension. But at any rate, when I pull this back, you'll see that plunger pop up, right? And in front of the striker, you'll see this little tiny plastic sleeve right here, right? Now that sleeve is also under spring tension. So if I can get this to show with proper lighting, when I push down on this sleeve, you'll see it move slightly. Now this sleeve is locked in to this plate. That's how this plate stays locked on the back of the slide. When you push the sleeve down, this plate is no longer locked into place. So what you can do, you can slowly move the plate down towards the bottom of the slide. What I would do is I would only move it down partially, right? You don't have to swipe the whole thing off immediately, because once it's moved down partially, this little striker sleeve right here, that plastic guy, is no longer engaging the lock on this plate. Now, like what I said, you're going to keep your hand over the top of this, right? Because when you pull this plate out, right? And I'm trying to do this while showing you as much as possible. You heard that spring pop right there. That was one of the springs that are under tension in there. Pull it the rest of the way, and ta-da! Yeah, the backer plate off. I'm just going to put it right here, right? And then you'll see that little sleeve right there. You can push up on the striker right here in order to lift this assembly out. This is essentially a single piece right here. When you pull this out, your striker is going to come out with that little sleeve, and I'll show you what I was talking about. So this is the part of the slide backer plate right here that you see on the slide. But if you turn it around, you'll see this little circular notch right here. And that circular notch interfaces with this plastic sleeve, like so. So that's what keeps it locked in place, because that sleeve is under spring tension. Okay? Now, taking a look at this. There is a spring for the extractor. This is the spring extractor and spring plunger. So, see that? That's the extractor. You see that the extractor is on the right side of the slide. If you see right here, the spring is under tension when this backer plate's on here, and it's pushing forward and putting tension right here. And when I pull that out, you'll see that the plunger is right here, right? Pull it all the way back out, and it comes out right like that. Now just remember, this goes plunger in, because the plunger's got to be pushing on the extractor, right? Now, this part is under spring tension. I would keep my hand right over your plunger, right? Striker plunger right here. Keep your hand over that when you go ahead and you pull the extractor out. When you push down on this, by the way, there shouldn't be any spring tension on this extractor, because right now there's a little shelf inside of this. And while it's under spring tension, the shelf is pushing up against your extractor. But what'll happen is if I push down on this plunger, the extractor will pop right out. See that? And maybe you can see it on the camera, but you'll see this little shelf right there that pops in and out, right? That's what's holding the extractor in place. So then once that extractor's out, you can go ahead and turn it upside down, and this guy should pop right out. Now there is a certain orientation that this goes inside of your gun. The easiest way to remember it is because this is working to block your striker from falling on the round. You'll see these two cutouts right here, right? That cutout and this cutout. Because this job is to block the striker from falling on a live round when you don't intend it to, this part with the shelf right here, right, is going to face the inside of the slide where the striker rides. So see that right there? The orientation of this goes like that, right? Another way to think about it is arrow points in. See how it's kind of sloped like a cone right here? Think of it as the arrow pointing inwards towards the striker when you go to disassemble it. So here's a little side note or a tip, right? This spring will actually come off of the plunger. You don't actually have to remove it if you want to clean the plunger, because the plunger should be easy to clean. You just have to wipe it down, and just as long as it's shiny, right, and you can put a little drop of lube on it if you want to, because it is a part that moves inside of the gun, you may. But once you wipe it off, it's pretty easy. I would also wipe off the front of the plunger here, but again, it goes back to, you know, if you've come this far to clean it, you might as well wipe the spring as well. The extractor does get a little dirty, so you might have to get like an old toothbrush and just this claw on the extractor, the part that hooks on the rim of the cartridge. You might have to run it on a toothbrush, and I can see, at least here in person, and see some carbon that's actually scraped off onto this brush, right? But what I would do is I'd go ahead and, you know, wipe it down. Maybe get some oil on this guy and wipe it down with oil, right? Prevents some corrosion and stuff. It also helps pick up dust and dirt. As far as your striker is concerned, this part will actually become really filthy with some fouling. So you can go ahead and clean this. Now, if you wanted to take this apart, say for some reason you got like a titanium nitride striker, you can push this down. You'll see that there's like two plastic halves on this. So the way that this works and the way that this is mounted on this is this plastic sleeve, this spring, and this little plastic cap right here are all retained by spring tension. What you have to do is you have to pull down on this sufficiently so that you can take these two ring halves off. Once you've taken those ring halves off, right, what you'll then do is you'll pull the spring off, then you'll pull this off right here. You don't actually have to do all that to clean this gun. I mean, unless you went and took like a swim in salt water with this thing and you really, really, really want to be sure that this isn't going to corrode, then sure, right? But this is kind of a pain to put back together. Actually, here, I'll just pull it apart right now just to show you. But once you do go to pull this apart, putting it back together is a real pain. So, all right. So I take the two plastic halves off. Look at how long that spring is. That's a lot of tension. And I'll show you what those two plastic halves look like. So there's that, and there's this guy right here, right? You can see that little shelf that this spring rode on right here, right? And so when I pull this spring off, you'll see this is where the little two plastic halves rode on right there. And you can see, maybe in the proper light, that this is polished a little bit better than the rest of the striker shaft. And the reason is because this is always moving, it's rotating a minuscule amount, and that plastic actually has enough carbon and some like gritty compound in it that almost acts like a polishing compound and smooths that metal out if you use a pistol significantly enough. But anyhow, sometimes what'll happen is with age, this plastic liner will get chewed up as well, this guy. So is it really necessary to replace this on a regular basis? No, because all it does is it just, as long as this rear part is intact and it's locking in with your backer plate right here, there's really no reason to have to replace this after, however many rounds, like 2,000 rounds or whatever. As long as you're not going around and, pushing down on this and chewing it up with like a knife or something, when you pull the slide apart, you should be fine. Because I do know that there are people out there who will, they'll be at a lack for tools. And when the sleeve is riding in here, they'll say, oh, I don't have a tool. So they'll use like a knife or a screwdriver and push down on it. And you might get away with it for a couple of times, but eventually you'll wear this out and you'll want to replace it anyhow. But once you have all those parts removed out of the slide, your slide has been almost completely disassembled. At this state that it is in right now, you can clean this very, very, very thoroughly. Most of these holes right here will fit like a Q-tip down it, right? See how there's some brass right here they already picked up, and then, the plunger hole right there. The only part that you can't get down into is this guy, the one off to the right side for the extractor plunger. For that, you're going to have to get your Q-tip and pull off some parts of it in order to get it narrow enough to fit down there like I just did there. And it is usually long enough to get all the way through right here on most of your Glock pistols. And you'll see, like, look at that. There's even some carbon that blows back through here. So just remember that what I would do is I'd take this slow. If you've already torn a Glock slide down to this point, you're not going to get this thing back together anytime soon anyhow. So take your time cleaning it. Make sure you get all the parts out. You'll see that there are 2 holes milled right here. One of them is for your extractor's plunger right here. This kind of acts as like a little pivot in the slide right here. And then this is the actual extractor claw. So here's another look. This part is where this pivots in the slide. You can see how it's silver right here. That's what it pivots off of when it's inside the slide and it's moving back and forth, right? And this is the actual claw on it. So, go ahead, make sure you get in here, make sure you get in there, get this guy right here too. Maybe go down the striker channel right here, or the extractor spring channel right here. Get those. This back part stays pretty clean, so you don't have to worry too much about that. But when you do go to clean the rest of this stuff up, what I would do is I would go and get a brush, just basically scrub up and down this, right? I would scrub, right through here. The nice thing about Glock 9 mils is that you can just basically do this and clean the breech face right here, this breech face like I was. You can turn a brush all the way around in this sucker and clean all that up. And then same goes with through here, right? Go ahead, clean that, and then wipe it down nice and neat. What I will say is the thing with cleaning with a brush on this is that if you've ever held like a toothbrush as a kid and you've done this thing where you're flicking little chunks of toothpaste up onto the mirror and your mom got pissed at you or whatever because you're making a mess, that basically happens inside of this slide. So what I would recommend that you do if your pistol is really dirty because you run it suppressed or whatever, is I would go ahead and do the brushing part first and then go through and do this guy right here, right? Because what will end up happening is that all that carbon and gunk and stuff will just fly right back down there. If you clean the inside of this and then you do the brushing part, then you've essentially wasted some of your effort. Is it a huge deal? No, because the idea is that your gun will be cleaner than it otherwise was in the past. But, why make yourself any extra work? So, The last thing is you'll notice that when I was explaining that this slide is almost completely taken apart, a lot of people hear that and be like, wow, it is taken apart. I've never even taken my Glock apart that far. Correct, but I haven't removed the sights. That's a different process. For the rear sight on a Glock, depending on what sort of sight system that you have, some of them have a set screw, some of them don't. But you need a sight pusher for this. And then on the front, there's a little bolt right here that you have to unscrew in order to lift this sight off, right? I'm not going to do that. Sight install videos, there's plenty of them out there, so I don't need to bother going over that. This spring right here, what I usually end up doing when I'm cleaning springs is I'll fold a piece of cloth, and you don't have to do this, but I will just fold a piece of cloth to go in between the wires and turn it, you know. Again, if you've come this far, why not, right? And then I'll just turn it one way, then I'll turn it the other way. And it just basically wipes the spring down. You know, if you're a real perfectionist, you might like doing that. So there you go. And as far as this guy's concerned, you can just wipe it down because this is plated metal, so it's pretty easy to clean. All right, so back to the reassembly process. As far as the Glock slides are concerned, basically when you go to reassemble it, it's all the steps that you took to disassemble it backwards. So if you aren't mechanically inclined, then just reassemble it with this video and pause it wherever you need to. But we're going to start with this guy because this is going to be the most difficult process right here, right? I'm going to drop this basically with the U facing down because that's how it locks in, right? Now, what I found is that this spring is the biggest pain to drop back down. This is taking a little bit of pressure from me to even drop this down. So I am probably going to do some stuff to hold this down if I don't get it easily the first time. But what I will do is I'll try to do it with just my two hands right here to put it back together. But what ends up happening is that people will sit there and try to reassemble it doing this, right? Like pushing it down like this, and then holding it down with like the edge of their finger like this, like a little claw, right? But the problem with doing that is like you get one half in, and because it's not retained by the other half, it'll want to pop out. And you'll have to forgive me. I don't want to lose one of these halves right now and then never find it. So it's really difficult to do this and show on camera what's actually going on. But you'll just have to trust me that I'm trying to get this thing put back together without losing any pieces. But regardless, this is pretty big pain in the ass. So you will find your own way to do this, but this is also, again, why I say don't pull this guy completely apart, especially if you're not experienced with this, because, you know, you do this and you're just like, oh my God, I can't put this back together. I got to find somebody else who can do it for me. I will also add that people who ask about titanium nitride, like strikers or titanium strikers even, because they're lighter weight or whatever perceived benefit it is that people get out of this. I don't really see a benefit to it, frankly, just because of the fact that, if you're doing it for titanium nitride, that tells me that the only excuse you have is the supposed natural lubricity of titanium nitride, right? And, you know, I don't really see a point to that because this part of the gun doesn't really get that, you know. I've never gotten one of these things so dirty that I needed the benefits of titanium nitride, right? What you'll see is right here, I just put it in a vise. That's because I don't have three hands, and you really do need three hands to do this. I don't have this clamp. Well, first off, I have these little rubber vice jaws right here to protect me from scratching this plastic or the striker, right? I'm basically using this as a little shelf to compress this down so that way I can actually get these little plastic half bastards in there. Now, if you do this ever, right, make sure that like you're not fully wrenching down on this guy, because the worst thing that you can do is break him. And I wouldn't want you to have to break your gun that you supposedly spent good money for, right? But this is the easiest way I can do it. I could sit there and like jack around with my fingers and do this whole thing, but you're just going to end up, and you can actually get it back together like that, but it's a pain, so I wouldn't recommend it. Anyhow, you'll see that I'm using this magazine that has like a steel shank inside of it. I made this myself. ProMag sells one, but it's made all out of plastic, so that's why I avoided it, because I wanted something that was stiff and strong and wouldn't break ever. So I made this myself out of an old worn out PMag. So once you have this back together, go ahead and drop this guy in right here, right? I wouldn't push it in all the way. I'd probably put the striker right here about a third of the way in. I'll explain that here in a little bit. Now go back to this guy. This is your striker plunger. If you have a Gen 3 or Gen 4 Glock, it's a circle. And the circular ones can go in any orientation that you want, as long as it's like vertical properly, right? But it's not like orientation dependent this way, right? Just remember, arrow side facing in on this guy. And when you do drop it in vertically, because you're trying to make sure that the spring is facing the top of the slide, that it's not, getting stuck on this little ramp and getting bent, because then you have to get a new one if you sufficiently bend a spring doing that. Then, once this is in, what you're going to do is you're going to push this down. I would say push your plunger down just about as far as it'll go in here, right? Because of the fact that you're trying to get this notch pushed up. Once that notch is pushed up, go ahead and drop your extractor in there with the claw facing forward, right? And then once it's dropped in there, you can release pressure on this, because this is maintaining tension on this. As long as you don't drop the slide or you bump it or something like that, it just shouldn't fall apart on its own. Then I would go ahead and push this down a little bit further just to make sure it's snug, and then get your extractor, plunger, and spring. And then I almost had it upside down there. Make sure your plunger goes in first, right? Spring side facing back. Now what I would do is, once this is all together like this, go ahead and get your backer plate and get it started on the back. You don't have to put a death grip on this. You just have to hold it like this with a tiny bit of pressure going that way. Now, I would get a punch or something, push down on this guy right here while you're pushing up on this. The reason that you're pushing up on this while you're pushing down on that little plastic striker liner is so that way, once you get it down sufficiently far enough, you push your slide plate up in its way. So that way, in case like this slips or whatever, this doesn't go flying off into the black hole of lost and forsaken gun parts. It sucks when that happens, and you don't want it to happen to you. Once that's up, then go ahead and push down on this guy, right? That was your plunger and spring for your extractor right there. Once that's down and retained, you should push up until it pops. And there you go. Your slide is almost reassembled right here. In order to fully reassemble it, what you're going to do is you're going to drop your barrel in muzzle first, then breech last. Then you're going to put the spring right here. And you're going to want to push a little bit forward on it until the spring is riding on this little semicircle right here that's cut out. And the reason it's riding on that semicircle is because this is also circular right here. This pushes on that ledge. So like this, right? And then push forward and down. And you have an assembled slide right here. If you are watching this because you build polymer 80s or, you know, whatever, right? This is basically your Glock upper right here. This is what you'd be purchasing if you're building a polymer 80. Anyhow, let's go ahead and get working on the frame. So for this frame, what I'm going to be using is one of these guys. This is going to seem confusing to a lot of people because they're going to look at it and they're going to be like, wow, that is a really weird shaped tool. This tool is essentially much more beneficial for magazine disassemblies, which I'll actually go into here in a little bit, but it has a little punch included in it. So if you see me using this punch on this guy, right, don't think to yourself that you have to go out and get this. I would really only recommend this for people who are assembling and disassembling a bunch of magazines, right? So in order to pull your lower apart, you have to start with this pin right here, right? So what I have usually told people when it comes to Gen 3 or Gen 4 Glocks, and in some cases the Gen 5, is that on the frame, there's this. This is your slide release. The reason it has this little metal tab right here is because when your magazine runs dry, and I actually might as well just show you this, just that way you have that knowledge. But when your magazine runs dry and you have fired all your rounds, you'll see the orange follower right there. That orange follower basically overcomes the spring pressure of this slide release right here and pushes it up. Now, when that is pushed up like this, you'll see a little notch in the slide, right? This notch right here. This, when it is pushed up, is supposed to lock into this notch right here. When it locks into that notch, right? See where the notch is located on here? Your slide locks back. What I will say is that if you have a weak magazine spring or an incorrect magazine spring, you can get a slide to fail to lock back. Another issue with the Glock is if you have an improper grip on your frame. So a lot of people like doing this grip nowadays. That might change in the future, like 10, 15 years from now. But this looks like it's here to stay, right? Some people with smaller fingers or not with the proper grip will cover their slide release with their thumb right here. And that can also cause some issues. If you're having issues to have your slide lock back, just remember that those two failures that I just mentioned are just two of the most common reasons why a slide won't lock back. There's a lot of reasons slides won't lock back, but those are two things that you can look out for. But anyhow, back to this tab and why I was mentioning it. On a Gen 3, Gen 4 Glock, or a Glock 43, Glock 42, Glock 48, any Glock that has 2 pins or single pin, whatever, this component is sometimes retained in here on this little notch that's cut out on this pin. So it makes it easier sometimes to push down on this little tab right here and then push this pin out. So on a Gen 5, that shouldn't really be an issue, but sometimes it is, right? So you can see how I'm pushing this pin out. I'm just holding my fingers back here, just that way I can catch this pin as it comes out. But this is what the pin looks like right here that's retained in the frame. It's also magnetic, so if you have one of these guys that costs like $199, $299, easy way to keep track of your parts. Now, once that's out, right, these parts are pretty loose, they're kind of hinged on that pin right here. But before you can remove your trigger bar, and your slide release right here, you have to remove what's known as a locking block. Now, if you've assembled your own Glock, say polymer 80 or otherwise, you'll be very familiar with this locking block because it is a very critical component of Glock pistols. Now what you see me doing with a punch right here is this right here is a takedown lever, right? The one I was talking about earlier. And you'll see why I said that you have to push down on both sides. Because if you push down on one side, it only gets one side down, right? You have to push down on both sides to completely lower this guy right here. That's tricky for some first timers, but everyone gets it eventually. What I usually do is I will get a punch or something, and I will basically lever up on this locking block, right here, this frame block, that's right here. And once you've gotten it up sufficiently, there's like a little notch right down here. You can also leverage up right there. Now you'll see that my slide release and stuff is coming up with it. That's just the tension in between the locking block and the slide release. That doesn't normally happen because these are separate components. But once I pull this out, you'll see that it's cut like at an angle, right? So when you pull this out, it'll come out like this, not up and down like that. What you saw with me pushing it up with a punch is just the easiest way to do it. If you have a punch, I certainly recommend doing it that way. But I mean, I've pulled this thing out with chopsticks before because I had like Panda Express. I was done with my food, and so I just used some chopsticks because I really didn't care if the chopsticks broke. Anyhow, once you get that locking block, right, this guy out, you'll see this is the single pin style, right? Even though what's funny is they say that this is a Gen 5 locking block, but there's a cutout for a second pin right here. But I haven't really tried interchanging Gen 3, Gen 4, and Gen 5 locking blocks, so I don't actually know if it's compatible with each other. But you can pull out this guy right here, right? So this is your slide release. You'll see a little spring right here, right? And then once you've done that, you'll notice there is your trigger right here. You can't pull your trigger out just yet though, because your trigger is retained by this pin. There's another pin right at the back here, right there, right? You have to push this pin out in order to remove the trigger bar, and your disconnector, as well as your trigger pack and ejection block and all that stuff. So I push this pin out. It should be pretty easy to remove this pin, but this pin is also the one that you would remove if you're going to put a new back strap on your Gen 4 or Gen 5 Glock, right? Your Glock should have, if it came with the back strap, should have come with another plastic pin that's a little bit wider than this that locks your back strap in place. Your back strap will hook on from the bottom here, and it'll pivot forward, and then while you're holding it in, start pushing your plastic pin through, and then get the rest of the way with like a punch or a chopstick or whatever, right? All right, so now that we've removed that, I can simply pull up on this, right? And this whole thing comes out. I'll show you again how that came out, just because that was a little quick. But this trigger pack at the rear here, actually, so this trigger pack at the rear here is essentially held in by a little bit of tension. If it's stuck, don't force it. What I would say is, using the same technique as you did for the locking block, get like a punch and push up on this ejector right here. This is the ejector. So when the slide comes back, right, and it's holding an empty cartridge or a live one, regardless, and it's coming back, the edge of the cartridge hits this, and that basically pops out the round from the slide, right? So you can push up on this guy right here, and it removes this pack right here, right? I'll put that off to the side for a second. So this Glock is almost completely disassembled. There's just two more parts on it that are left remaining. The first is the takedown lever, right? And then the next is your magazine release right here. So I will describe those really briefly here. So, on a Gen 5 Glock, there's one of the changes that they made was they put a coil spring underneath the takedown lever right here, right? So you'll see that there's this tiny little coil on Gen 3 and Gen 4 Glocks, and before, I believe, they used to have a leaf spring right here. Basically, the leaf spring would come from here under this block and push up on it. Why they changed it, I don't know. Maybe it's just because it gave some additional structural rigidity to the frame, but the reason doesn't really matter. We are here where we're at right now. So if you want to swap this because you found like a super pretty like nickel or titanium nitride finished one, whatever, right? You can push down on this and then push sideways on your takedown lever. So there's a little coil spring right here. I'll show this with a smaller punch, but if you push down on that with a smaller punch, I'm sure you could use even like a knife blade if you wanted to, right? I'm not going to take mine apart because I already had enough of a pain in the ass taking the striker apart. So, but if you push down on this guy, you should be able to slide your block out off to the side. But just know that you have to actually have this pulled down sufficiently enough in order to slide it out. And then pushing it back in, what you have to do is you have to push down on that coil spring sufficiently enough while you're pushing this takedown lever in until the takedown lever is over the coil spring, at which point in time you can slide it in the rest of the way. That's how you'd swap this out. Now, as far as your magazine is concerned, so, or your magazine release right here, right? So, if you look down into your Glock, right, you will notice that there is a wire that runs up out of the frame right here and into a little latch on the magazine. Now that wire has a place where it can go in order to release from the magazine release right here. And there's like a little notch in there. In order to, say you have a Gen 5, and Gen 5 is ambidextrous, you can swap it from left side to right side, right? What you're gonna do is you need, I would recommend a punch for this, or a Glock armorer's tool if you're in a real big pinch, but those things kind of suck, so suit yourself. But what you have to do is you have to push this wire over towards where there's a notch in the magazine release. And once it's at that notch, it has to push out towards the opening for the magazine right here, right? So you have to push it out towards the magazine. And once that wire is released from there, then you can push out the magazine release from the opposite side the button is on, and then swap it around, and then basically hook that little wire back in using a punch, or maybe needle nose pliers if you have like really fine needle nose pliers that can grip the wire. Guide it back into the cutout on the magazine release, and then push it back in, and your magazine release will basically be re-engaged with that spring. So once you do that, then your frame is completely disassembled. If you have taken apart your frame to this point just to clean it, I would use a Q-tip. That seems to be the easiest way, and just get all the really small nooks and crannies down there. Basically all the big flat surfaces. I would go down with a rag, right, and wipe it down thoroughly, and then make sure that everything is carbon free, basically. Because this is all plastic, right? You shouldn't have a ton of trash or whatever that gets blown back into the frame of this gun. So, it should be fine. But more importantly, you will probably have to get to this point with where this frame looks in order to do a trigger swap. So that's what I'll be going over. So on a trigger swap, You have a few options to do. I know that one of the first modifications that a person will do is the disconnector. Ghost Ink, and that's on Gen 3, 4, and 5, is the disconnector. Just remember that Gen 5 disconnector is different from Gen 3 and Gen 4 disconnectors, but disassembly process is relatively the same. Anyhow, in order to swap the disconnector, right, you have to get the trigger out of the way. And I guess you don't have to, but it makes it a lot easier. So what you're going to do is you're going to push this trigger bar assembly back and out like this, right? And that gets rid of your trigger bar assembly. If you get like a Zev or an Apex trigger and you just buy this part, right, all you have to do in order to swap this is that step backwards again, right? And I'll show you on the reassembly process. So, pull this out, get your new one, and push it back in. Anyhow, now that you've gotten to this point, right, if you're doing this to clean it, again, just wipe down all the surfaces. This disconnector is seated inside of this body, right, through friction alone, because it's basically, most of this thing is stamped metal. So the stamping goes into this hole on the opposite side. Get a punch or chopstick, if you can find one that's narrow enough, to push in here. When you push in this on that, what you'll see is this comes out. I wouldn't like lift on this with like a knife blade or something, because I feel like that might bend this. And this, right, the reason that it's lifted up a little bit off of that is because this tension right here determines some of your trigger pull weight. So I would not recommend getting like a knife blade and like sticking it in here, right, and pulling up on it. I doubt that it would, bend this metal, but you might not even notice how much it bends, and you actually like bend it and suddenly your trigger pull weight's a little different. So I always recommend going from this hole out and pull this out, right? Once you've pulled this out, I would say go ahead, wipe this guy down a little bit. What's really common, the Glock manual does say this as well, is if you are going to lubricate this component, right, you get like a little dropper of lube. This one's actually Weapon Shield, which is also recommended by Glock. And just put like a little bit on this contact surface right here, and that's good enough. Right, super small amount. A little bit goes a long way with lubricant on these weapons especially. Once you've taken the disconnector out of this trigger pack and you've gotten it to this point, you can remove this spring that's in here. I don't know why you'd want to, but if you wanted to, it's essentially a matter of pushing down on this guy, right, and then pulling up. I'm not going to do that just because of the fact that, again, I don't know why you'd want to. So what I'd say is if you really had to clean this, go ahead, spin your little Q-tip in there a little bit. Maybe wipe down the outside of this. If let's say you're getting all that copper anti-seize that Glock is notorious for using off of this, go ahead, wipe this down. And that's that, right? That's basically being cleaned off. In order to reassemble it, again, backwards process. Push this in through the right side right there. Get your trigger bar. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe this guy down real quick. Right? Make sure that this is clean. Now, once you wipe that down, what I would say is if you had to lubricate it, this little spine, this curve right here, you shouldn't have to put oil on this. And this plate right here on the back side, you shouldn't have to put oil on that either. But, if you have to, go ahead. The reason I say that is because if you already put oil on this, those are the two surfaces that engage with each other. So you shouldn't have to worry about that. So when you go to put your trigger back in, know that your trigger bar has to hook under that little spring tab that's inside of the trigger pack right here. And when that's hooked in, one of the wings on the trigger bar also has to go inside of your trigger pack right here, because that's what it rides in. Once that's in, what I like to do is I like to make sure that this tab on the trigger bar slides under the disconnector. And the reason I say that is because if it's not under there, it's a little bit too wide. And if you don't know that it's doing that and you try to push this in right here, you will see that it is the same width as your rear slide rails. And if it's not pushed under that disconnector, it's sometimes too wide to fit inside of your frame between those slide rails. Just a little bit of food for thought, something to pay attention to. Once you've dropped your trigger pack in here, before you go any further, what I would recommend is you take your plastic pin and you push it in here. If you have any difficulty pushing it in, go ahead and look and make sure that your trigger pack is all fully seated inside the frame and that the hole's aligned right there. And then what I would do is push this in the rest of the way, right? And you can see that there's a little bit of resistance there, but when I push down on this, got rid of that resistance. What I like to do is I like to look from the back of the frame and make sure that the pin is in symmetrically. Does it really matter? No, it's a gun that you're gonna be using, right? So it doesn't have to be perfect and pretty, but that's just what I choose to do. So once this is in, what I like to do is I like to push the trigger bar all the way down. What I've generally found is that when it's pushed all the way down, it's closer in alignment with your single pin up front. Once this is in, what I would do is I'd get your slide release. You can go ahead and clean this guy off too if it's dirty. Does it really matter? Again, no. A Glock pistol you can pretty much run with minimal cleaning and be okay for your average shooter. But if you're shooting it suppressed or with high round count, I might recommend cleaning this if I were you. But, you know, it's a reliable enough gun, so you shouldn't have it too much of an issue. Once you've got your trigger bar inside of your frame and the trigger pushed down, I would drop this in. This little U shape at the bottom here goes around your trigger. Because as you'll see, there's a hole here, just as there was a hole on the trigger right there, right? And when you put this in, all of those should align through right there. Now, next process is your locking block, which also has a hole. When you push this in right here, it goes back in diagonally the way that it came out. And if this is your first time doing this, what I recommend is you look through and make sure that you at least see light all the way through this. If, you know, there's a component that's really blocking something in there, maybe take another look at it, but you should be able to like maybe wiggle the slide release around a little bit or the trigger around a little bit and generally get this all, you know, lined up properly. Another way to do this is get your punch, put it through all the way, and just push it in the direction that it needs to go. You know, don't push too hard, don't pound on it. You don't want to damage your frame because it is plastic at the end of the day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this in. Really, the sides don't matter. Some people say it does. If somebody says it does, I really haven't found a reason for it to matter, but you should be able to push this right on in, right? It might be tough the last little bit of the way, but you shouldn't have to force it, right? If it's stuck, it's stuck. Like, stop, don't break anything. But it should be stiff without feeling overly tight. And once it's in, just make sure it's even on both sides and it's good to go. So your frame is reassembled, your slide is reassembled. Go ahead and push your slide on back from the front, right? And then make sure it's all aligned, and you should be able to pull your slide back up. Hold on. So here's a good example of what's going on. You should be able to go ahead and pull your slide on and back like that. What you saw right there with me stopping a little bit is just making sure that it wasn't seizing up on anything or any of that. But if that does happen to you, one of the common issues is this recoil spring, as well as the guide rod and stuff, can sometimes pop out of your barrel channel. So if it does that, push it back down, right? If you try to put it on and you force it, right? Like you're sitting here and you're trying to go back and forth, what has likely already happened is that this has popped up and now your slide is stuck on a frame without completely being mounted on it, and it's going to be kind of a pain to pull it off. But if that does happen, you should be able to push it forward, right? Like this, in order to get it off. It shouldn't truly be jammed up. If it really is though, I'd go get some help. So again, put it on, and it should go on just that easy right there, right? You should be able to pull it back and go all the way back, by the way, to where the slide won't travel back any further, and just let go. Do not ride the slide forward. Once you've done that, make sure the slide is staying on. Some people, especially newbies, what they'll do is they'll get like one slide rail on and not the other, and all sorts of stuff, right? That shouldn't happen. So just make sure that everything's aligned, and then once it's on, pull it straight back and you should be good. Now, what you're gonna do is a function check. So you have your gun put together. So what I would do is I'd first get an empty mag, make sure it's empty, right? If you have a Gen 5, it has an orange follower, make sure you see orange. Put your magazine in. This one doesn't look like it's seated all the way because this is a Glock 19 and this is a 17 mag. So yes, it is seated all the way, right? Because I can pull down on it, it's not coming out. And when I pull the slide back, the slide should lock back, right? Now, I can go ahead and drop this. And what I would say is, in practice, when you're actually using this gun, right, I would reach up and over. Gross motor action is better than fine motor action. Pull back and let go. But for the sake of example, in this case, to make sure everything works, right, you can go ahead and hit the slide release right here. I know that my slide release works. Now, go ahead and do a nice, easy trigger press while maintaining good fundamentals until the gun or the striker goes off. Now, while holding down the trigger, go ahead, pull and release your slide. And then release your trigger very slowly. What you should feel, tactile and audible sensation, is what's known as a trigger reset, right? And that reset tells me that the striker sear and the trigger, or the striker and the trigger bar, the sear engagement surfaces on the two have come apart, right? So, or actually they've come together and they're going to be in contact again when you pull the trigger back. So pull the trigger again and it goes off again. So I know that my gun is functional at this point. And go ahead and you're good to go with this guy. So that's all there is to it. You can load it up, you know, get going again, take it apart again, clean it, whatever. But fact of the matter is, stay safe. At no point in time during this whole process should you have to load around in this to check to make sure that it works. Just make sure that if your gun is pointed somewhere, like you have a shop like me, make sure it's pointed at like a good, safe direction. I know a lot of people don't have the luxury of having a basement. I don't know, maybe you live in Texas and you don't have a basement, right? If that's the case, just make sure that the direction that's pointed in is preferably towards a corner of the room where there's studs in the wall, just so that way you don't risk having a round go downrange. I don't even know why you'd have live rounds in the gun while you're disassembling it, but you know, just double check, triple check, make sure that there's no rounds inside the gun. And if you're afraid of that, make sure it's pointed in a corner where there's studs. That might be more likely to stop a round. And practice all the other good safety techniques. So that's it. Hopefully this was educational for you, and stay safe.